Side 3. A Summer to Remember by Mary Balogh. Continuing on page 79. You were chosen, he said, because you have a reputation for unshakable dignity and gentility and respectability, for being the perfect lady, in fact. My friends considered you to be the lady least likely to accept my proposal. Because you are a rake? This was all a game, then. A tone, she realized, matched his own in flatness. But a remarkably foolish one. What if you had won? You would have been stuck for life with a prim, respectable wife. A perfect lady. A perfectly dull lady. That is what I am, Lord Ravensburg. The sharpness of her pain was ridiculous. She had never respected this man or believed his preposterous flatteries. She respected him even less now. What did it matter that he had made a wager concerning her only because she was dull? For that was what dignity, gentility, and respectability added up to for him. And he was quite right. She was exactly what he thought her to be. She had always been proud of being a lady. She was still proud, so the pain was not valid. She was not really feeling it, only anger, against herself more than against him. She had known from the start who and what he was. She had deliberately chosen not to listen to her family. She had wanted to assert her independence. And all the time she had been persuading herself that she was immune to his charm. No, he said, you do yourself an injustice. And it was not just a game. I really do need a bride. Someone like you. But I should not have courted you with such insensitivity, with such careless disregard for you as a person. I should not have allowed you or any other lady to become the object of a wager. You may be the perfect wife for me, but I would be just the worst possible husband for you. She should have risen to her feet then, the explanation given, and made her way back to the main path and the box where Mr. and Mrs. Merklinger waited. For very pride's sake she should have left, and refused his escort. But she did not move. Why do you need a bride by the end of June? She asked him. That is less than 2 weeks away. And why a perfect lady? She could not quite keep the bitterness from her voice. I had better tell you everything. He sighed and took a step closer, but he did not sit down beside her. He set one foot on the wooden seat instead and draped an arm over his raised leg. His face, only inches from her own now, was as serious as she had ever seen it. I have been summoned to Aldersley for the summer, he said. My father's principal seat, that is. My brother's death, almost 2 years ago, made me his heir and forced me to sell my commission, since he pointed out to me that I was no longer free to put my life at risk every day. My life was suddenly valuable to him, you see, even though he banished me forever the last time I saw him. You did not wish to sell out? She asked, noting the unusually bitter tone of his voice. As a younger son, I was brought up for a military career, he said. It was what I wanted anyway, and I enjoyed it, all things considered. It was something I did well. She waited. There is to be a house party in celebration of my grandmother's 75th birthday this summer, he told her. My banishment has been revoked. The prodigal is to be allowed home, after all. He is to learn his duties as the future earl, you see. And one of those duties is to take a bride and set up his nursery. It is my father's intention, in fact, to make my betrothal the central event of a summer of festivities. It is to be a birthday gift to my grandmother. All was beginning to make sense. Her respectability, her reputation as a perfect lady, made her a good candidate. She had been chosen with cold calculation, as most brides of her class were, of course. Had he been open about his intentions in the start, she would not have been offended. There was nothing intrinsically offensive about them. The Earl of Redfield has instructed you to choose a respectable bride? She asked. Was it he who suggested my name? No. He tapped his free hand against the leg on which he stood. Actually, He has another prospect in mind. Oh? My dead brother's betrothed. Oh! Lauren clasped her hands tightly in her lap. How very distasteful for both Lord Ravensburg and the poor lady who was being handed from one brother to the next like a worn inheritance. And my own before him, he said after a slight pause. But when given the choice 3 years ago, she chose the heir rather than the second son, the mere cavalry major. Ironic, is it not? She might have had both me and the title. But I no longer wished to marry her, and so I decided to choose my own bride and take her with me when I go as a fait accompli. I wanted a bride to whom my father could not possibly object. Your name was suggested to me, not as someone who would surely accept, but as a lady of perfect gentility, who probably would not, hence the wager. Lauren looked at her hands in her lap. She was not sure he spoke the strict truth. She thought it more likely that she had been named as someone who would almost certainly accept his proposal with alacrity. Was she not a jilted, abandoned bride after all? A woman past the first blush of youth who would surely grab with desperate gratitude the first man who asked? But if that was so, why would 3 gentlemen have wagered against his success? But did it matter? I beg your pardon, he said. You have been the victim of my unpardonable lapse of honor. I owed you honesty from the start. I should have approached the Duke of Portray with my offer and been content with whatever he might have said. But it is too late now to court you the right way. You have done nothing to deserve such shabby treatment. Please believe me to be truly contrite and most humbly your servant. May I escort you back to the box? He returned his foot to the ground and offered his arm. She continued staring at her hands while he waited. Another crossroads. Yet there was nothing further to decide, nothing more to say. Because you are a woman, a beautiful woman, and I am a red-blooded male. Because I desire you. All a lie, and she was undeniably hurt by it. It had all been a ruse to lure her into accepting him and winning his wager for him. But still, a crossroads. No, wait, she said softly, even though he was already doing that, waiting to escort her out of his life. Wait a moment. Kit watched her spread her fingers in her lap. She did not speak again for a long while. Felt damnably wretched. All he wanted to do, if the truth were known, was to take her back to Mrs. Merpinger's side and wait out the evening with all the patience he could muster, and to seek out his 3 friends in the morning to pay his debts before taking himself off to Aldersley. He was deeply mortified to realize that in consenting to make a lady, a perfectly innocent lady, the subject of a sordid wager, he really had tainted the honor he held so dear. It had seemed faintly amusing at the time, before she had become a person to him. Another group was approaching along the narrow path, this one more boisterous than the couple before them, and they came right along even when they saw that they were interrupting a tete-a-tete. Kit sat down beside Lauren, and the 4 revelers walked past in loud silence, their eyes carefully averted, and then laughed and snickered before they were quite out of earshot. Kit stayed where he was. "Will you go to Ulverston, then?" Lauren Edgeworth asked, "and betroth yourself to your former fiancé, after all?" "I hope I may avoid that fate," he said. "Does she wish to marry you?" she asked. "I very much doubt it," he said. "She preferred Jerome to me 3 years ago, though one never quite knew with Freya." "I will make a bargain with you, Lord Ravensburg," Lauren Edgeworth said, her voice quite steady and calm, "if you will agree to it." He turned his head to look at her, but her eyes were still directed downward at her spread fingers. "I will go to Aldersley with you," she said very deliberately, "as your betrothed." He sat very still. "As your temporary betrothed," she explained. "I will go with you and be presented to your family and be everything you hoped I would be. I will be there while you establish yourself again as your father's son, and while you take your rightful place in his home as his heir. I will be there, so that a distasteful engagement will not be pressed upon either you or the lady who once chose your brother rather than you. I will give you some breathing room, so to speak, during the house party and the birthday celebrations. But I will not marry you. At the end of the summer I will leave Aldersley and break the engagement. I will do it in such a way that no censure will fall upon you. By that time it is to be hoped that your family will have accepted your right to choose your own bride in your own time. He could not possibly be misunderstanding her. She spoke very precisely. But what the devil? You would break the engagement, he said, frowning. Do you realize what a scandal that would cause? You would put yourself beyond the social pale. I think not, she said, with a faint smile for her hands. There would be those who would congratulate me upon having freed myself just in time from marriage to a rakehell. But I care little anyway. I have told you that I am not in search of a husband, that I have no intention of marrying. What I have realized only very recently is that I need to break free of my well-meaning relatives, who treat me as if I were both a green girl and excessively fragile goods. In reality, I am a woman who long ago reached her majority, and I have a comfortable independence. I intend to set up my own home, perhaps in Bath. After spending the summer at Aldersley, supposedly as your betrothed, and then breaking the connection, I will find it far easier to do what I ought to have done a year ago. None of my relatives will argue with me. I will be demonstrably unmarriageable. What the devil? He stared at her profile and realized fully what he should have realized long ago, that he did not know this woman at all. Yet he had been prepared to marry her within the next 2 weeks. Were you deeply attached to Kilbourne, then? He asked her. Her head dipped a little lower. Her fingers closed and then spread again. I grew up with him at Newbury Abbey, she said, from the time I was taken there at the age of 3. In some ways he seemed like my brother as much as he was Gwen's, but I always knew, too, that we were intended for each other when we grew up. I shaped my life to the expectation that one day I would be his countess. Even when he bought his commission and went away, telling me not to wait for him, but to feel free to marry someone else if I wished, I remained loyal. I waited, but while he was gone, he married secretly, and then watched his wife die in an ambush in Portugal, or so he thought. He came home and would have married me after all. It seemed as if life would proceed in the direction I had always expected it to take. But Lily did not die. She came home to Neville on my wedding day. He was not deceived by the lack of emotion in her voice. This story had been the sensation of last year, but almost all the gossip, he guessed, had focused upon the glorious love story that was Kilbourne and his ladies. Lauren Edgeworth had been pitied, spoken of no doubt in hushed, shocked whispers. How many people, himself included, Kit thought, deeply ashamed, had really considered the pain the woman must have suffered, and must still suffer. She had been within a few minutes of fulfilling a lifetime's dream, only to have it shattered most cruelly. You loved him? He asked, though he was not sure the past tense was strictly appropriate. Love, she said softly. What is love? The word has so many meanings. Of course I loved him, but not in the way Neville and Lily love each other. Love of that sort is a disordered, undisciplined emotion best avoided. I would have remained loyal and faithful, and of course I loved him, she sighed. I will contemplate no other marriage, Lord Ravensburg. He gazed at her, deep pity and guilt holding him silent, but she appeared to read his thoughts. I am not asking for your pity, she said. Please do not offer it, or even feel it. I need only to be accorded the privilege that men expect as a natural right, to be allowed to live my life my way, without having those who claim to love me forever knowing better than I what it is that will make me happy. I want to be alone and independent. If I ruin my reputation this summer, I will achieve that for which I ought not to have to fight. Good Lord, he said, running the fingers of one hand through his hair and then leaning forward to rest his forearms across his legs. How can I agree to this? Having spoken of honor just a few minutes ago, how can I now agree to deceive both my family and yours? And how can I leave all the burden of breaking our betrothal to you? You do understand, do you not, that as a gentleman I could not possibly break it myself? And therein is your answer, she said. To you, the betrothal would have to be a real one, my lord, would it not? If I were to behave dishonorably, you see, and refuse to break it off, even after striking a bargain with you, you would have no choice but to marry me. And so you would be involved in no deception if you were to agree to my suggestion. He tried to find a flaw in her argument, but really there was none. Of course, if he agreed to her strange proposal, the betrothal would be a real one for him. And perhaps, yes, perhaps he could redeem the honor he had lost in the past few weeks and persuade her after all during the summer to marry him. Perhaps he could persuade her that what he had to offer was slightly more appealing than a life alone. Women, even those with the means to live independent lives, had very little real freedom. He did not love Lauren Edgeworth. He did not even know her, he admitted ruefully. But of one thing he had grown painfully aware during the past half hour or so. She was a very real person with very real feelings, and she was one for whom he felt a certain regard, and one to whom he owed a debt. Are you sure a large house party would be to your taste? He asked her, sitting upright again. For the first time, she turned her head to look at him. I believe it would suit me admirably, she said. I was brought up to be a countess, remember? I was brought up to expect to run Newbury Abbey one day, to be the lady of the manor. Going to Aldersley as the betrothed of the Earl of Redfield's heir would be something I could contemplate with the greatest confidence and ease. You would not be disappointed in me. He frowned into her eyes. But why would you do all this merely to convince your family to leave you to your chosen way of life? He asked. Pardon me, but you are no timid or easily dominated female, Miss Edgeworth. All you really need to do, surely, is tell them that you have made up your own mind about your future, and they might as soon save their breath to cool their porridge as seek to change your mind. She looked away again, to the dark trees at the other side of the path, to the sky above, just visible through the branches of the trees. Your concession tonight confirmed me in all the bad things I have thought or been told about you, she said. For a while I could think of nothing but getting away from you and never seeing you again, but... For a while it seemed that she would not continue. He waited. My life has been quiet and decorous, she said. I have only recently realized that it is also dull. Its dullness suits me. It is what I know, what I am comfortable with, what I will live with quite contentedly for the rest of my life. But recently I have felt a craving to know, just once, what it would be like to have some sort of adventure. I do not know how to put the feeling into words. I think that spending a summer in your company, masquerading as your betrothed, would be rather adventurous. This all sounds very lame, put into words. But she was saying much more than the words themselves conveyed. She was, obviously, a woman who had never known joy, who had long ago repressed all her potential for spontaneity and happiness. What I would get out of this bargain, she continued, would be your promise, Lord Ravensbird, to give me a summer I would not forget for the rest of my life. Adventure and, well, adventure. It is what I want in exchange for extricating you from an unwanted marriage. He thought she was finished, but she held up a staying hand when he would have spoken. She was looking at her other hand again, spread palm up in her lap. There was a morning, she said, at Newbury, just a few days after my wedding, the wedding that never was. I was walking early and alone down toward the beach. 3 things I almost never do. When I was descending the hill into the valley leading to the beach, I grew aware of voices and laughter. It was Neville and Lily, bathing together in the pool at the foot of a waterfall there beside a little cottage Neville's grandfather built for his wife. The door was open. They had spent the night there. They were, well, I believe they were both unclothed, and they were, I think the only suitable word is frolicking. It was the moment when I realized that she had won in more ways than one. He was blissfully happy, you see, and I could never have done that. I could never have behaved with such total abandon. At least I do not believe I ever could. It was passion I witnessed for a mere few seconds before I ran away as fast as I could. She drew breath to continue, but shook her head and stopped. "Are you asking," he said, "for a summer of passion as well as adventure?" "Of course not." She seemed more herself for a moment, straightening her spine and lifting her chin, looking shocked. "I just want to know what it feels like to throw off some of the shackles that bind me. Just fleetingly. I'm not a person made for wild, passionate emotions. All for vivid happiness. I just want a summer to remember. Can you give it to me? If so, I will come to Aldersley with you." Good Lord. He sat back on the seat and looked at her averted face. She was a far more complex person than he had ever dreamed. A wounded person. One who, for some reason he did not understand, had never been whole and never free. Even if she had married Kilbourne, he suspected, she would have lived a half-existence, hidden behind her mask of perfect gentility. What exactly was she asking of him? To bring her out from the shadows in which she had dwelled all her life? To teach her spontaneity and passion and laughter? Joy? So that she could then abandon him and proceed with the lonely spinster existence that was all that remained of her dreams? Did he want to take on such a challenge and responsibility? What if he could not do it? Worse, what if he could? But a good challenge had always been the breath of life to him, and if he agreed to this bizarre proposal, he would, of course, go into it full tilt, determined to win her as his wife. She loved Kilbourne, always had, always would. He was not looking for love, but could he bring her out into the light? "I can give you a summer to remember," he said. She turned her head sharply in his direction. "You agree, then?" He nodded. "I agree." It was the precise moment at which the first fireworks exploded with a series of loud cracks. Even within the shaded grove where they sat, they could see the night sky suddenly lit up with great arcing rays of dazzling color. 7. Lauren was on her way to Aldersley Park. The long journey into Hampshire must be almost over, in fact, she thought. The afternoon was well advanced. More than 2 weeks had passed since the evening at Vauxhall, when all this madness had begun. And madness it surely was. At the time she had imagined, if she had stopped to think at all, that she would simply ride off with Viscount Ravensburg on their masquerade, that they would proceed the very next day to Aldersley and her summer of adventure. It had not turned out that way. Of course it had not. Even before she had tossed and turned her way through a sleepless night, after the Merklingers had conveyed her home, she had realized that what she had agreed to, no, what she had suggested, was not just a carefree fling for the two of them, but a huge lie that was to involve a large number of people. Common sense and a regard for propriety almost prevailed at that point. She almost dashed off a note to Lord Ravensburg, cancelling all their plans. Almost. But she had gone down to breakfast first, and Elizabeth had asked her about the evening at Vauxhall. "It was very enjoyable," she had replied, and after a moment's hesitation, "Elizabeth, he asked me to marry him, and I said yes." Elizabeth had risen hurriedly to her feet, despite her bulk, and hugged Lauren and laughed with delight, and assured her that she had made a wise choice despite anything that Aunt Sadie and her ilk might say to the contrary. "You have chosen to go with your heart after all, Lauren," she had said. "I am so very proud of you, and happy for you." Lord Ravensbourg had called only an hour or so later to speak with the Duke of Portray, though he was not in any way Lauren's guardian. It was a visit Lauren had not expected him to make, but one that Elizabeth had commented upon with approval. Suddenly it had seemed out of the question simply to ride off for Ulversley with her betrothed. How could she, Lauren Edgeworth, have thought for a single moment that it might be possible? Suddenly everything had become very formal and correct. Announcements had had to be made, to Lord Ravensbourg's family to expect her, to her grandfather in Yorkshire, to her family at Newbury Abbey, to her relatives in London, to the Tall at Lodge. The betrothal, the fake betrothal, had become alarmingly real, and no carefree adventure at all. Uncle Webster had rumbled with displeasure, and called the Viscount, in his absence, an impudent puppy. Aunt Sadie had called for the hartshorn, and Wilma had volubly declared herself speechless. Joseph had looked faintly amused, but had offered no comment beyond a wish for Lauren's happiness. The Duke of Portray had given it as his opinion that Lord Ravensbourg's notorious exploits amounted to nothing more than a sowing of wild oats. His military record told its own impressive story, he had added. He and Elizabeth had hosted a grand family dinner in celebration of the event the day before Lord Ravensbourg left for Ulversley to break the news to his parents, and 2 days before the announcement appeared in all the morning papers. It had been impossible to come to Ulversley alone, or with only a maid for company, of course, even though the journey could be made in 1 day, and impossible, too, to make the journey with Lord Ravensbourg's escort. Such behaviour simply would not be proper. They were not wed. Elizabeth was within a month of her confinement and quite unable to travel. Lauren would not even ask Aunt Sadie to accompany her. It was Aunt Clara, the Dowager Countess of Kilbourne, who was doing that, and Gwendolen, the widowed Lady Muir. They had come all the way from Dorsetshire to London in order to cry over her, and laugh over her, and hug her until her ribs felt bruised, and to accompany her to Ulversley at the invitation of the Countess of Redfield. All was very formal, very proper. Lauren felt weighed down by the hugeness of the lie she had set in motion. She had not told even Gwen the truth, and there had been no word from Lord Ravensbourg to tell her how well or how ill his announcement had been received at Ulversley. Only the letter, a formal invitation from his mother. "Ah," Aunt Clara said now, waking from a doze that had kept the 2 younger women silent, and had left Lauren alone with her thoughts and her conscience. "This must be it. I will not be sorry to see the journey at an end, I must say." The carriage, the Duke of Portray's, complete with all the pomp of ducal crest and splendidly liveried coachmen, postilions, and outriders, had just passed through a small village, and was slowing to turn between massive wrought-iron gates, which a porter was throwing wide. He stood aside, glanced up into the carriage, and dipped his head, pulling respectfully on his forelock. "Oh, Lauren," Gwen leaned forward to squeeze her cousin's knee, "this looks very impressive indeed. You must be bursting with excitement. You have not seen Lord Ravensbourg for almost 2 weeks." "I am eager to make the young man's acquaintance," Aunt Clara said. "Despite Sadie's disapproval and Wilma's foolish vapours, I am prepared to like him. Elizabeth does, and she is invariably sensible in her assessment of character. And he has won your regard, Lauren. That must override any possible doubt I might feel." Lauren curved her lips into a smile. They felt remarkably stiff. She did not want to be doing this, deceiving the 2 people who were dearest to her in the world, deceiving the Earl of Redfield and his family, bowling along through a shaded, heavily wooded park toward a charade of her own making. But of course, it was too late now not to be doing it. How could she have made that irresponsible suggestion at Vauxhall? What on earth had possessed her? She was never impulsive, and she did not even like Lord Ravensbourg. did she? Certainly she did not approve of him. His dancing eyes and his frequent laughter suggested altogether too careless an attitude to life. He positively delighted in doing and saying outrageous things that was simply not gentlemanly. At this precise moment, she thought with some alarm, she could not even remember exactly what he looked like. Suddenly, the carriage interior was flooded with sunlight again. Lauren moved her head closer to the window beside her and gazed ahead. They had drawn clear of the forest and were approaching a river, which they were going to cross by a roofed Palladian bridge. To her far left, she could see that the river emptied its waters into a lake, which was just visible among the trees. Beyond the bridge, well-kept lawns sloped upward to the classical elegance of a large grey stone mansion. The lawns were dotted with ancient trees. On the lake side of the house were stables and a carriage house. "Oh," she said, and Gwen pressed her face to the window too, turning her head to look backward. "Splendid," Aunt Clara said. She was looking through the opposite window. "That must be a rose arbor beside the house with flower parterres below it." Then Gwen was patting Lauren's knee again and smiling, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I am so happy for you," she explained. "I knew that sooner or later you are bound to meet the man who was created just for you. Are you very deep in love with him?" But Lauren only half heard. The carriage had turned past the stables, and its wheels were crunching over a wide gravelled terrace toward the steep flight of marble steps leading up beyond massive fluted pillars to the mansion's great double doors, which stood open. There were people on the steps, 2, 3, no 4 of them, and at the foot of the steps, dashing and elegant in a form-fitting coat of blue superfine over kite-grey pantaloons and shiny tasseled Hessian boots, a sunny smile on his face. "Ah, yes," Lauren said, though whether in answer to Gwen's question or her own foolish fear that she would not recognize him, no one thought to ask, least of all Lauren herself. Kit had been restless all day. He had ridden for hours alone, across country, following no particular route, trying to kill the hours until she could reasonably be expected. Then back at the house he had paced in and out of front-facing rooms, peering out through the windows long before the carriage could possibly roll into sight, unless it had left London in the middle of the night. He had even walked briskly down to the lodge shortly after luncheon to chat with the porter for a while. He wished this whole thing were not happening. He wished, now that it was too late to do things differently, that he had simply written to his father earlier in the spring with a firm refusal to have any marriage arranged for him. He should have refused even to come home until he felt more ready to do so. He should not even have sold out last year. He could be with the armies now, doing what he did best. He should have written to his father. But the trouble was that he was Ravensburg. He was the heir, and as the heir he had responsibilities, which he had shirked for almost 2 years, even though he had ended his career. It was his duty to be at home, to make his peace with his father, to learn what the future Earl of Redfield needed to know, to take a wife, to father sons, yes, preferably plural. But was he fulfilling those duties even now, with a sham engagement, and a homecoming that would have been difficult even under the best of circumstances? His father had been predictably furious when after the first awkward exchange of greetings following his arrival he had made his announcement. The situation, he had then discovered, was far worse than he had realized. A marriage settlement had been discussed and fully agreed upon by his father and the Duke of Bewcastle, Freya's brother. They had even signed a contract. It had apparently not occurred to either of them that it might be advisable to consult the wishes of the prospective bride and groom first. Kit doubted that Freya's wishes had been consulted. His mother had been dismayed and then tearful. The tight hug with which she had greeted him had not been repeated since. Even his grandmother had shaken her head at him with unspoken reproof. She was unable to say a great deal, having suffered an apoplexy 5 years before, from which she had never quite recovered all her faculties. She still treated him with affection, but he knew that he had disappointed her. And Sydenham? Well, he and his younger brother, who had shaken hands awkwardly and without making full eye contact on Kit's arrival, had had a nasty falling out that same night, and now scarcely spoke to each other. He sat fountain in the steward's office after everyone else had retired to bed, writing laboriously in a ledger with his left hand. "So this is where you disappeared to after dinner," Kit had said. "Why here, Sid?" "Hawkin retired before Christmas last year," Sydenham had explained, looking at the warm leather cover of the ledger rather than at his brother. "I asked father if I could take his place as steward of Ulversley." "As steward?" Kit had frowned. "You, Sid?" "It suits me very well," his brother had told him. Kit had assumed that Sid was living a life of enforced idleness here, without his right arm, and with only his left eye out of which to see, and with no possible way of doing what he had been created to do. They had exchanged no letters in 3 years. He had assumed that Sid could not write any, and he had written none of his own because there had been nothing to say. "How are you?" he had asked. "Well," the single word had been spoken abruptly, defiantly. "I'm perfectly well, thank you." "Are you?" Sydenham had opened the top left-hand drawer of the desk and placed the ledger inside it. "Perfectly well." They had been unusually close when they were younger, despite the 6-year gap in their ages. He had been Sid's hero, and in his turn he had adored his young brother, who had possessed all the qualities of character that he lacked: steadiness, sweetness, patience, vision, dedication. "Why did you tell me to leave?" Kit had blurted suddenly. "Why did you join the chorus?" Sydenham had not had to ask what he was talking about. After their father had banished Kit 3 years before, Sid had got up from his sick-bed and come down to the hall, looking like a ghost and a skeleton combined, clad only in his nightshirt, his valet and a footman hovering anxiously in the background. But instead of offering the expected sympathy, he had told Kit to leave, to go, not to come back. There had been no word of farewell, no word of forgiveness. "You were destroying all of us," Sydenham had said in answer to his questions. "Yourself, most of all. You had to go. I thought you might defy father. I thought you might go after Jerome again and kill him. I told you to go because I wanted you gone." Kit had crossed the room to the window, from which the curtains were drawn back, but he had been able to see nothing outside, only his own reflection thrown back at him, and Sid's, still seated at the desk. "You did blame me then," he had said. "Yes." The single word had pierced his heart. He would never forgive himself for what had happened, but without Sid's forgiveness there was no hope of any kind of lasting peace, only more of the restless search for forgetfulness, which he had been able to achieve with a measure of success while he had still been commissioned, but which had been impossible to find since he sold out. He had tried. It hardly rested day or night. "Yes, I blame you," Sydenham had said, "but not in the way you think." It had not been worth pursuing. "Do you think," Kit had asked, "but I would not have taken all your suffering into my own body if I could? I wish it had been me. I wish I had made that choice. If you could be made whole again, do you not think I would give my life to make it happen?" "I'm sure you would," his brother had said. "I am quite certain you would, Kit." But there had been no forgiveness in his voice, only harsh bitterness. "I do not want to talk about this. It was my suffering, and these are my deformities, and this is my life. I asked nothing of you, nothing whatsoever." "Not even my love?" The words had been almost whispered against the window-pane. "Not even that, Kit?" "Well." Kit had turned and smiled, feeling as if all the blood in his body were draining downward, making him rather light-headed. He had crossed the room toward the door with deliberately jaunty strides. He had let himself out and closed the door behind him before bowing his head, his eyes closed. No one had been made happy by his return to Aldersley, least of all himself. He felt like a stranger in his own home, an uncomfortable, unwelcome stranger. He felt useless. He, who had always been active and brilliantly successful and highly respected in his career. His father had made no move to educate him in the duties of the heir, or to include him in any activities of his daily routine. Perhaps he was waiting until after the house party and the return of normality to the household. And Kit, too, felt as if he were waiting for the next phase of his life to begin. Yet the very next phase was to be a charade, a lie. Unless that was, he could persuade her to marry him after all, and redeem some of his honor by doing what was right by her. He had not been sleeping well, again, and when he did nod off from sheer exhaustion, the old nightmare kept rearing its ugly head. Sid. By the middle of the afternoon, he found himself in the drawing-room in company with both his mother and his father, who rarely spent his afternoons there, as well as his grandmother. The others sat in quiet conversation, while Kit made no pretense of doing anything but standing at the window waiting, his eyes fixed on the point of the driveway just beyond the bridge, at which a carriage would first come into sight. They were all waiting, of course, for the unwanted, unwelcome arrival of their guests, though none of them had been discourteous enough to put it quite that way. Kit's betrothal had caused an awkward rift with their neighbours at Lindsay Hall, 6 miles away, the Duke of Bewcastle and the Bedwyns, his brothers and sisters. Kit had ridden over there on his first morning back, and had asked to speak with his Grace. Bewcastle must have assumed, of course, that the call was a courtesy one, for the making of a formal offer for Freya. Kit had been shown into the library almost immediately. Wulfric Bedwyn, Duke of Bewcastle, was not the sort of man anyone in his right mind would deliberately cross. Tall, dark, rather thin, with piercing grey eyes in a narrow face, a great hooked nose, and thin lips, he bore himself with all the unconscious arrogance of his breed. He had been brought up from the cradle for his present position, and so had always held himself somewhat aloof from his brothers and his brothers' friends. Even though he was only a little more than a year older than Kit, he was a cold, humourless man. He had not exploded with wrath when informed about the betrothal. He had merely crossed one elegantly clad leg over the other, taken a sip from his glass, the very finest French brandy, of course, and spoken softly and pleasantly. Doubtless, he had said, "You are about to explain." Kit had felt just as he used to feel during his boyhood years when hauled up before the headmaster at school for some mischief, caught out, in the wrong, on the defensive. He had prevented himself only just in time from acting accordingly. "And you will explain," he had replied just as pleasantly, "why you would negotiate a marriage contract for your sister with my father rather than with me, the proposed husband." He had found himself being regarded steadily from cold, inscrutable eyes for long, silent moments. "You will excuse me," his Grace had said softly at last, "for not offering my felicitations on your betrothal, Ravensburg. You do, however, have my congratulations. You have a fine sense of revenge, better than you used to have. Less brash, shall we say." He had been referring to 3 years before, of course, when after breaking Jerome's nose, he had galloped hell for leather over to Lindsay Hall and banged on the outer door for half an hour. It had been late at night, before Ranulph, Bewcastle's brother, and Kit's particular friend, had opened it and told him not to make an ass of himself, but to go on home. When Kit had demanded to hear the truth of her betrothal to Jerome from Brayer's own lips, Ranulph had come outside, and they had stripped down and engaged in ferocious fisticuffs for all of 15 minutes before a burly footman and Alain, another brother, had dragged them apart, both bruised and bloodied, both snarling and struggling to continue. Bewcastle, standing outside the door, silently observing the fight, had then advised Kit to take himself off back to the peninsula, where his rage could be put to better use. Freya had stood at his side, her head thrown proudly back, a smile of open contempt on her lip as she stared at Kit. She had not uttered a word. "Now, 3 years later, Kit had been framing an answer to the Duke's words when the library door behind him was suddenly flung back against the bookshelves, and His Grace's eyes had gone beyond Kit's shoulder, his eyebrows rising haughtily. "I fail to recall," he had said, "inviting you to join me here, Freya." But she had stridden into the room regardless and approached Kit's chair, ignoring her brother. Kit had risen to make her a bow. "You have certainly taken your time about leaving the pleasures of London behind," she had said, tapping a riding whip against her skirt. "I am on my way out for a ride with Elaine. If you wish to call upon me, Lord Ravensbird, you may make an appointment with Wolfe, and I will see if I am free that day." She had turned to leave without waiting for his answer. She had not changed in 3 years. Of slightly below medium height, but generously endowed, she carried herself with proud grace. No one, even in her infancy, had ever called Freya pretty. She was one of the fair Bedwyns, and wore her thick golden hair, as she had always liked to wear it, quite unfashionably, in long loose waves down her back. Like the other fair Bedwyns, she had startlingly dark eyebrows and a dark-toned complexion, and the family nose. As a child, she had been ugly to the point of freakishness. Then she had blossomed into young womanhood, and ugliness had been transformed into a startling handsomeness. She had always, from infancy on, been a spitfire. "Lady Freya," Kit had murmured. "If you had simply gone riding, Freya," her brother had said, still in his soft, pleasant voice, "instead of feeling constrained to announce in person your intention of not receiving Viscount Ravensbird, you might have been spared having to learn thus publicly what he has come here to inform me. He has recently become betrothed to Miss Lauren Edgeworth of Newbury. She will be coming to Albesley within the next week or 2. Freya was not his sister and a Bedwyn for nothing. After a moment's silence, she had turned her head back over her shoulder to smile at Kit, a baring of the teeth that bore a resemblance to a smile, anyway. "Oh, well done, Kit," she had said softly. "Well done indeed. You have learned subtleties you used not to know." She had left the room without another word. 3 years before, Kate had conceived a sudden all-consuming passion for the woman who had been his playmate all through their childhood. She had always flatly refused to be excluded by her brothers and their friends, even from their wildest exploits. She had seemed to return his sentiments in full measure. He had talked of marrying her and taking her back to the peninsula with him to follow the drum. She had said nothing to discourage him. He had believed that summer that he would willingly die for her. And then, when Jerome had suddenly, without warning, announced his betrothal to her, Kit had thought he might well die of her betrayal. But that had been 3 years ago. Much water had passed beneath the proverbial bridge since then. "Ah," he said now, his mind back in his father's drawing-room, his eyes on that point just beyond the bridge where the deer forest ended. "Here it comes." A carriage, unmistakably grand, drawn by 4 perfectly matched horses and escorted by outriders, had come into sight. There was no possibility that it was merely a neighbor come to call on his mother or grandmother. Everyone was rising, he saw, when he turned toward the door, even his grandmother with the aid of her cane. But of course, they would all do what was proper and come down to welcome the unwelcome guests with formal hospitality. He wished suddenly that it was a real betrothal, that it was a love match, but at last he would be able to convince his family, and keep them convinced, that he had done something that was right and responsible and good for the whole family when he had chosen the Honourable Miss Lauren Edgeworth to be his Viscountess. He would have offered his grandmother his arm, but his father was before him. He gave it to his mother instead, and they descended the stairs, walked through the echoing hall, and went out onto the steps together, without exchanging a word. He'd always been the most troublesome of her 3 sons. If ever there were mischief to be got into, and there always had been, he had invariably been at the center of it, the instigator and main participant. But she had always loved him anyway. Sometimes she had even shed a tear over him after his father had finished with him in the study. Since his return, except for her first warm hug, he was not sure she loved him at all any longer. The carriage was almost at the stables. Godfrey had sent them in his own coach then, and surrounded them with all his ducal pomp. It was all so very damnably proper and ceremonial. Had he really imagined, during that mad hour at Vauxhall, that he could simply load her into a hired carriage the very next day and bring her here to surprise his parents with their announcement? He moved away from his mother's side and ran down the steps to the terrace. Deuce take it, but this felt strange. He was about to see her again. Their grand masquerade was about to begin. Was she nervous? And then the carriage rolled to a halt. One of the postilions jumped down to open the door and set down the steps, and Kit stepped forward, smiling and stretching up a hand. He was half aware of the other two ladies, but it was Lauren Edgeworth who leaned forward and set her gloved hand in his. He had half forgotten how very beautiful and elegant she was. Her dove-grey travelling dress and bonnet, both with violet trim, appeared quite uncreased by the long journey. She looked fresh and lovely and perfectly composed. Lauren. He handed her down and bent his head to kiss her cheek, though somehow he caught one corner of her mouth as well. Kid. They had agreed at Vauxhall, or rather he had persuaded her, that they should use each other's given name, but they had not done so until now. He squeezed her hand, still clasped in his own, and grinned at her. Suddenly, a 2-week-long depression lifted like a physical weight from his shoulders, and he felt a surge of confidence and exhilaration at the prospect of the days ahead. Lauren really had been the right choice for him, even if only for the summer, and there was to be all the challenge of getting her to change her mind about the summer's ending. He loved challenges. "And Clara," Lauren said, as he turned back to the carriage and gave his hand to the older of the two ladies within. "This is Kit, Viscount Ravensbird, my aunt, the Dowager Countess of Kilbourne." She was a smart, handsome lady with shrewd eyes and proud demeanor. "Mom," he said, making his bow to her after handing her down. "And Gwendolen, Lady Muir, my cousin." He handed down the younger lady, who was very small, very blonde, and very pretty. She looked at him with sparkling, friendly assessing eyes as he bowed to her. Then it was time to turn and make the introductions to his family, who were waiting on the steps. All was accomplished in a manner that was perfectly smooth, perfectly civil. If Lauren was feeling any misgivings, any nervousness, she certainly was not showing it. Neither were his parents showing in any way at all that their son's betrothal was anything but perfectly acceptable to them. His grandmother, when they were introduced, even took Lauren's hand in her good one and drew her down for a kiss. "Pretty," she said, nodding in that way she had of indicating that she would say far more if she could. "Might have known it would choose a pretty one." Lauren showed no discomfort at having to wait an inordinately long time for the short sentence to be completed. She was smiling, yes, actually, and giving his grandmother her full attention. "Thank you, Mom," she said. But Kit had suddenly noticed Sydenham standing on the top step, inconspicuous in the shadow of one of the pillars, half turned so that his left side faced out. Kit took Lauren by the elbow. "There is someone else I want you to meet," he said, and led her up the step. He half expected Sid to flee through the open door, but he stood his ground. "My brother Sydenham, Lauren Edgeworth, my betrothed Sid." If she felt shocked as she saw him fully, she gave no sign, not even a stiffening of her elbow against his hand. When viewed from his left profile, Sid was as extraordinarily good-looking as he had been all his life. But as soon as he turned, the beholder could see his empty white sleeve pinned neatly against his coat, the purple marks of the old burns discoloring and immobilizing the light side of his face and neck, and the black patch over his right eye socket. Beauty and the Beast occupying the two halves of the same body. Sid held out his left hand, and she did not hesitate to take it in her left, so that they could exchange a handshake that was not awkward. "Mr. Butler." "Miss Edgeworth, welcome to Aldersley," Sid said. "Has your journey been very tedious?" "Not at all," she replied. "I have the company of my aunt and cousin, you see, and the knowledge that Kit would be here waiting for me at the end of it." Kit looked at her appreciatively. She sounded so warmly convincing that he felt a foolish lurching of pleasure in the region of his heart. But his mother was, as always, the perfect hostess. She would accompany the ladies to their rooms, she told them, coming to join them on the top step, so that they might have an opportunity to freshen up before tea was served in the drawing-room. She took Lauren's arm, drawing her away from both her sons, and led the way inside, while Lady Kilbourne and Lady Muir followed behind. Lady Muir limped, Kit noted. 8. Gwendolen was playing the pianoforte, while the Earl of Redfield stood behind the bench, turning the pages of the music for her. The Countess and Aunt Clara were seated side by side on a love-seat nearby, alternately listening to Bach and conversing with each other. Sydenham Butler was sitting on the window seat at the opposite end of the drawing-room, where he had been ever since they had moved here from the dining-room following dinner, slightly turned so that his right side was in the shadow of the heavy velvet curtain. What had happened to him? Viscount Ravensbird, Kit, moved about the room, smiling, genial, occasionally interjecting a remark into a conversation, but not becoming a part of any group, and never approaching his brother. He looked restless, rather like a caged animal of the wild. Lauren had spent almost the whole evening seated beside the Dowager Countess, Kit's grandmother, close to the fire, though she had obliged the company by taking her turn briefly at the pianoforte. She had told the old lady about Newbury Abbey, about the weeks she had recently spent in London, about the few entertainments in which she had participated there. She had also listened. It was not easy to do when the Dowager's speech was halting, punctuated by long, painful pauses as she tried to form words. It was tempting to interrupt, to supply the words she knew were about to be spoken, to complete sentences whose endings she could guess long before the words were out. It was what the Earl and Countess tended to do, Lauren had noticed, both at tea and at dinner. Perhaps they were embarrassed for her in the company of guests. Perhaps they thought they did her a kindness, but it seemed unfortunate to Lauren. She listened, giving the old lady her full attention, keeping her expression bright and interested. Nevertheless, there was a great deal of time in which to think and observe. She had been welcomed to Aldersley with meticulous courtesy, but perhaps without warmth. But she had not expected warmth. Courtesy was enough. Kit had played his part well. He had looked so delighted to see her, in fact, that Gwen had been totally beguiled. She had come into Lauren's room before they went down to tea together, hugged her and beamed at her. "Lauren," she had said, "he is quite gorgeous. That smile! And when he kissed you for all to see, as soon as your feet touched the ground, I could have quite swooned with the romance of it." She had laughed merrily. "You said he could be quite outrageous." That last remark had not been a criticism, though the kiss, brief peck though it had been, had almost robbed Lauren of her poise. There had been almost no communication between him and his parents since her arrival, she had noticed. All three of them had spoken with her, with Aunt Clara, with Gwen, but not with one another. They were very upset with him, then, over this betrothal, when they had hoped for another for him. And perhaps none of them could forget that he had fought with his elder brother 3 years ago, presumably over the woman they had both wanted to marry, and that afterward the Earl had sent him away and told him never to return. How bitter an experience it must have been for the Earl to see his eldest son die, and suddenly to have his exiled second son as the new heir. And how doubly bitter to Kit to know that his banishment had been revoked only because of his elder brother's death. Kit and his younger brother both behaved as if the other did not exist, and yet Kit had made a point of introducing them on her arrival, and it had seemed to her at the time that he was fairly bursting with affection for his horribly wounded brother. What had happened? The Earl of Redfield's family was certainly not a close or a happy one, she concluded. Suddenly, the task ahead of her, the task she had taken on so glibly that night at Vauxhall, seemed daunting indeed. How could she help reconcile Kit with his family when the wounds were apparently both deep and long-standing, and when she was responsible for widening the gap, deepening the wounds, and when she was going to break off the engagement? But her thoughts were distracted by the Dowager Countess, who had grasped her cane with the obvious intention of getting to her feet. Lauren restrained her first impulse to jump to her feet to help. She had not been asked for help, and any intrusion on her part might be resented. She smiled instead. "Going to bed, mother?" The Earl was striding toward them. "Allow me to summon your dresser." "I am going to walk first," she said. "The evening air will not be good for your lungs, mother," the Countess said, raising her voice. "Wait until the morning." "I'll walk now," the old lady said firmly, waving her son away with her free hand. "With Kit and Miss Edgeworth." "She will insist that fresh air and exercise are good for her," the Countess was explaining to Aunt Clara. "Though I am sure a rest would do her more good. She insists upon walking along the terrace and back every day, rain or shine, but usually it is in the morning." Kit meanwhile had come to draw his grandmother's free arm through his own, while she leaned on her cane with the other hand. He was grinning his usual sunny smile. "If you wish to walk now, Grandmamma," he said, "we will walk now. If you wish to dance a jig, we will dance a jig, until you have worn me out. Will you come too, Lauren?" "Of course," she said, getting to her feet. And so, 5 minutes later, they had donned cloaks for warmth and were strolling slowly along the terrace away from the stables, Kit's grandmother on his arm, Lauren on her other side, her arms clasped behind her. "Tell me," the old lady said, in her habitual, slow, laborious manner, "how you two met." Kit's eyes met Lauren's over the top of her head, his eyes dancing. "Grandmamma is an incurable romantic," he explained. "You tell her, Lauren." But he was so much cleverer at such stories than she, Lauren thought. Gazing across a crowded ballroom, eyes alighting on her, heart skipping a beat, knowing that she was the one woman in this world meant for him, he could make it all sound quite soulful. Besides, it needed to be told from his perspective. She could, of course, describe. Her smile was entirely an inward one. "It was in Hyde Park one morning," she said, and watched the laughter arrested in Kit's eyes before she turned her head away and continued. "Lord Ravensburg, Kit, was in the middle of a fist fight with 3 labouring men, while half the gentlemen of the door cheered him on. He was stripped to the waist, and he was swearing most vilely." She listened to herself in some amazement. Lauren Edgeworth never told such sordid tales, and she was never motivated in either speech or action by a sense of mischief. The old lady surprised her with a bark of laughter. "The men had insulted a milkmaid," Lauren continued, "and Kit had ridden to her defense. He knocked them all down, and then kissed the milkmaid as I was passing in company with my aunt and cousin. Actually, Grandmamma," Kit said meekly, though Lauren could tell from his voice that he was enjoying himself, "it was the milkmaid who kissed me. It would have been ungallant to have taken the moral high road and turned my head away." His grandmother chuckled. "And then our eyes met," Lauren said, lowering her voice, "and it happened, just like that." She had never suspected that she had acting abilities. She was almost convincing herself that there had been an element of fate in that first shocking encounter. "Every woman," the old lady said, Lums are rogue. She chuckled again. Well, I was warned against him, Mom, Lauren said. He has the most shocking reputation, you know. But when we met again at Lady Mannering's ball, and he wangled an introduction and asked me to dance with him, how could I resist? It was a waltz, you see. They had arrived at the end of the terrace. The daylight had gone, but the moon and stars prevented it from being a dark night. That is a rose arbor just ahead of us, Kit explained. I will show it to you tomorrow, Lauren. I can smell the roses even now, she said, inhaling their heavy, sweet scent appreciatively. The formal gardens are below it, he said. Beyond them are the trees. But there is a wilderness walk there with several pleasing prospects, all carefully planned, of course. I look forward to seeing it all, she said, as they turned to stroll back to the house. But when they had arrived there and climbed the steps and entered the hall, the old lady lifted her cane to summon the footman who was on duty. Your arm, she told him, relinquishing her grandson's. Kit, you must show Miss Edgeworth the roses. He bent his head to kiss her cheek, his eyes alight with laughter, Lauren could see. A tryst, all carefully orchestrated in advance, Grandmamma, he asked. Morning is your usual time for walking, after all. But we will not disappoint you. I will take Lauren to the rose arbor, just so that she may smell the roses, of course. Lauren felt as if her cheeks were on fire. Kit was laughing as they descended the steps to the terrace again, her arm drawn firmly through his. I warned you that she is a romantic, he said. She sat there in the drawing-room all evening, observing her grandson and his newly betrothed, who had been apart for 2 weeks, constrained by a roomful of relatives and good manners into exchanging no more than the occasional polite observation and yearning glance. I did not give you any yearning glances, she protested. Ah, but I did you, he said, turning in the direction of the rose arbor. And, of course, Grandmamma had to devise a way to give me an opportunity to kiss you thoroughly before sending you off to bed. She was intensely embarrassed. I hope, she said primly, I did not give the impression that you are deep in love with me, he suggested. I believe you did, to Grandmamma at least. And then you told her that story of our meeting to confirm her impression. I did not expect that particular one. My lord, they were halfway along the terrace. The charade is necessary only when we are in company with others. We need not go into the rose arbor. Your grandmother has gone to bed, I dare say, and will not know if we return immediately to the house. It is improper for us to be alone together like this. We are not really engaged. Oh, but we are. He moved his head a little closer to hers. Until I hear otherwise, you are my betrothed. And what is this nonsense about our game being played only for the benefit of others? And why have I become my lord again? I promised you adventure, did I not? And passion. We need to be alone together if I am to keep the promise. We are going to begin tonight in the rose arbor. You are going to be kissed. Kit, she said sharply, I did not ask for passion, at least not for kisses. I would never dream. You asked for adventure, he said, his mouth so close to her ear that she felt the warmth of his breath there. For passion. In many ways they are interchangeable terms. It would be most improper, she said, truly alarmed. She did not like to remember their kiss at Vauxhall. She had tried to block it from her memory. It had been so very alarmingly physical. I will try my best to see that it is, he said with a soft laugh as he let her down off the terrace and through a trellised arch into the arbor, where the scent of roses instantly assailed their senses. Kit! But the more indignant she became, the more on her dignity, the better he would like it, of course. She had learned that about him. He loved to tease. He would never take her seriously. She changed the subject. Perhaps you would forget this nonsense. Was your father very angry when you came home? Oh, Lord, yes, he said. He and Bewcastle, the lady's brother, that is, had actually signed a marriage contract. I am more in your debt than you realize, Lauren. The lady has been jilted, then, she said, wincing. I know how that feels. Is she hurt? Freya, he said. She had her chance 3 years ago. She is doubtless annoyed, which is a little different from being hurt. She is good at annoyance. All the Bedwyns are. But they have no right to be annoyed. My father had no right to plan a marriage for me without waiting for me to come home to give my consent. Do they live far away? She asked. 6 miles. He led her to a rustic bench, and she sat down. Our betrothal has caused dissension, then, between neighbors, she said. That is unfortunate. He set one foot on the bench beside her and draped an arm over his raised leg, just as she remembered his doing at Vauxhall. But unavoidable under the circumstances, he said. I really did not want to be forced into that marriage, Lauren. And yet, she said, you must have loved her 3 years ago. She wondered if she would have a chance to meet Lady Freya Bedwyn. Sometimes, he said, love died. She did not believe that. Certainly it was not true in her case, but there was no point in feeling guilty. He did have a right to choose his own bride, and she could see that without this temporary betrothal he would be trapped indeed. This was the very reason for their bargain. What happened to your younger brother? She asked. He abruptly lowered his foot to the ground and turned away to bend over a nearby bloom, as if he were examining it closely. War happened, he said, after a lengthy silence. He insisted, against everyone's advice and pleas, including my own, that our father purchase a commission for him in my regiment, so that he could follow me to the peninsula. The military life is the very last thing Sid was cut out for, but he can be remarkably stubborn when he chooses to be. I promised my mother faithfully, and foolishly, of course, that I would look after him and protect him from harm. Less than a year later, I brought him home, more than half dead after the surgeons and the subsequent fever had finished with him. It was touch and go whether he would survive the journey, but I was determined that if he was going to die, at least it would be at home. I can be stubborn too. She could just imagine how dreadful he must have felt. But surely you do not blame yourself in any way, she said. In the heat of battle it must have been impossible for you to protect him. It did not happen in battle, he said curtly. She waited for him to explain, but he said no more. Did anyone else blame you? She asked. Did he? Everyone, including me. The judgment was unanimous. He turned toward her suddenly, and she saw the flash of his teeth in the darkness. He took her hand and drew her to her feet. But that is all ancient history, Lauren, best forgotten. Sid survived. So did I. All is well that ends well, to coin a phrase that someone else must have coined before me. In the meantime, we are wasting a perfectly decent moonlit night and the opportunity for romance that Grandmama has sanctioned. Best forgotten. But it had not been forgotten by either brother, all resolved. It must have happened the same summer he had fallen in love with Lady Freya, and then fought his elder brother when she had accepted his offer instead. Little wonder he had been so upset if both his brothers had turned against him. And his father, too. Yet it was understandable that the Earl had sent him away. He had caused both his brothers physical harm. Now he had come back to Aldersley, and as far as she could see, all the old hurts were still festering. And now they had been made worse by this business of a marriage contract and his betrothal to her. What a mess she had walked into. Would she be able to do anything to put any of it right? But this was not the time for such thoughts. She had not deserted his mind or his intentions after all. He meant to kiss her. She turned away from him, drawing her hand free of his. There was no need for this. This was not what she had meant. But he stepped up behind her, wrapped his arms about her waist from behind, and drew her against him until the back of her head was nestled against his shoulder. She could feel all of his warm man's body against the curves of her back and thighs, and it felt good, she admitted, with an inward sigh of resignation. It gave the illusion of romance, the illusion of closeness, of intimacy. Though much of life, by its very nature, had to be lived alone, some of it, too much, in loneliness. She had asked for adventure, impulsively, without any forethought. She had never known that she wanted it. And what was it exactly she had wanted? What had she meant by adventure? This? Had she wanted to be kissed again, to be held again? She had never craved physical closeness with any man. Oh, with Neville, perhaps, but with him it had been more affection, companionship, comfort that she had sought. She did not know what made life a vivid experience for some people, like Lily. That was what she had wanted to discover. Lauren closed her eyes as the old unwilling hatred washed over her. What did Lily have that she did not? What did Lily know? She turned in Kit's arms, setting a little distance between them as she did so. She looked into his shadowed face and saw that he was watching her closely. She could never be like Lily. She could never be comfortable with the sort of embrace that had happened at Vauxhall. She was afraid that all those unfamiliar feelings would overwhelm her, and more afraid that they would not, that she would feel nothing if he kissed her again, that she would discover with absolute certainty that she was frigid, that he would turn away from her with distaste, that he would regret his bargain with her almost before it had begun, that she would know beyond any doubt that she was forever unlovable, undesirable, unwanted. No, no, he said softly, leaning his head a little closer, his hands at his back. Don't retreat into that iceberg. I have worked out that it is a mere defense, you see. I am not going to hurt you. I am not even going to kiss you, in fact. I have changed my mind. How absurd now to feel her heart plummet with disappointment and humiliation. It was better that neither of them discover the truth about her. But he did not even want to kiss her. Both his hands came up to unbutton her cloak, and one of them tossed it onto the bench where she had been sitting. The night air was cool on her bare arms. His hands, in contrast, seemed to brand her with heat as he moved his palms slowly downward from the scalloped hems of her short sleeves to the backs of her hands. He clasped them as she shivered, curling his thumbs into her palms and raised them to set on his shoulders. Then he rested his hands lightly on her hips. Lean your body against mine, he told her, from shoulders to knees. It sounded shocking indeed, the more so as she was the one required to make the move, not him. There was no suggestion of coercion in his hands. He would not force the issue, she knew. She would not have that excuse. She felt a sharp, pulsing ache in her lower abdomen and swayed toward him, bracing herself with her hands until the tips of her breasts touched his coat and then pressed against it. She closed her eyes and set her forehead against his shoulder. She could feel his muscled hardness and his body heat with all of her upper body. She could smell his musky cologne and the very maleness of him. He still did not move. His hands remained on her hips. She leaned her thighs against his, and her abdomen and hips followed. His hands slid around to her back then, but lightly, without threat. She could have escaped at any moment. He did no more than that. Neither did she. But her body felt and adjusted itself to the planes of his, soft femininity against hard masculinity, while her emotions were in turmoil. Behind her closed eyelids she could see him as he had appeared in the park that first day, stripped to the waist, splendidly muffled in his chest, shoulders, and arms, slender-hipped and lithe in his skin-tight breeches and boots, vital and virile and male, the same body against which she now leaned. She could hear his heartbeat. She thought she might well be on fire. Neither of them moved for what seemed a long time, but she knew one thing before she finally stepped away and bent to pick up her cloak. She had no experience with such matters, but she understood that physically at least he desired her. And she had discovered something else too. With her whole body, with her hot cheeks, with her tender swollen breasts and pulsing womb and slightly trembling sighs, she felt her femininity. She knew that despite the discipline of a lifetime, she was not just a lady, she was also a woman. He did not touch her or say anything, for which fact she was enormously grateful. She turned after a few moments to look at him, her cloak clutched in one hand. He was standing on the exact same spot. "So," she said, in an attempt to restore some semblance of normalcy, "your side of the bargain has been kept for 1 day, but I have mine to keep too, my lord. It would not do for us to be absent from the house any longer." She wished she could see his face more clearly as he regarded her in silence for a few moments. Then he bent to take her cloak from her hand, wrapped it about her shoulders and buttoned it at the neck, and offered his arm. "Yes," he said, his voice brisk and cheerful, "duty accomplished for 1 day. Tomorrow I will apply myself again. We will ride, early, at sunrise." She fought disappointment again at his tone. Would he not have said something a little warmer, more personal? Had she only imagined? But it did not matter. "I very rarely ride," she said, "and I almost never rise early." "Tomorrow," he said, "you will do both. I'm going to give you an enjoyable summer if I kill both of us in the process." "How absurd," she said. "Tomorrow morning early," he told her as they made their way along the terrace. "Appear voluntarily, and alone, or I will come into your bedchamber and get you myself." "You would not dare," she said indignantly. He looked at her sidelong. "That is one word that is inadvisable to use in my hearing," he said, "unless you are quite prepared for me to take you up on it. I would certainly dare." "You are no gentleman," she told him. "Why is it," he asked her as they ascended the marble step, "that you still say that, as if you had just now made the discovery?" 9. Kit was out in the stables when Lauren appeared there. It was only a little after 6 o'clock in the morning. Before leaving the house, he had sent his valet to instruct her maid to wake her, but she must have been up already to have arrived here so soon, and looking like elegance itself, in a forest green riding habit with a matching hat set just so on her carefully styled dark hair, its lavender feather curling invitingly about one ear. He had been looking forward to going to wake her himself. He would have dared. Her outrage would have been something to behold. "Good morning," he grinned at her. "I have had the quietest mare in the stable saddled for you. The only tamer animal would have to be lame in all 4 legs. I will be riding beside you. You have nothing whatsoever to fear." "I am not afraid of riding," she said. "I just do not enjoy it as an exercise. I resent this, you know. You are supposed to give me an enjoyable summer. Enjoyable to me. Not force me into doing things I distinctly dislike, like rising at this hour to ride." "No, no," he said, chuckling. "I promised you a memorable summer, and I always keep my promises. But if it will make you feel better, I can tell you that we will be riding only a short distance. I have something altogether more pleasurable planned for you. We are going to swim." "What?" She looked disdainfully at him instead of recoiling in horror as he had expected. It was very difficult to ruffle the outer feathers of Lauren Edgeworth. Good Lord, he had been aroused by her last evening, and she had been standing flush against him, and must have realized it, unless she was more of an innocent than she could possibly be at her age. Yet she had appeared as cool as a spring breeze when she drew away from him and informed him that his duty was done for 1 day. "I absolutely do not swim, my lord." "Kit, Kit, I do not swim, Kit. That is my final word." 2 strokes and a bubble?" he asked sympathetically, cupping his hands for her booted foot and tossing her up into the saddle. "You sink like a stone." "I really would not know," she said, arranging her skirts and sitting so gracefully that she looked as if she might have been born in the saddle. "I have never tried." Never tried? Good Lord, what kind of childhood had she had? Or had she skipped childhood altogether? Perhaps she had been born a lady. "Then you will start this morning," he told her, swinging up onto his own mount and leading the way out of the cobbled yard. "I will be your instructor." "I will not," she rode after him, "and you will not." If Vauxhall had not happened, he might have been repelled by her. So coldly dignified, so perfectly ladylike, so lacking in spirit and humor, so absolutely joyless, though even then, perhaps, he would not be able to resist goading her. But Vauxhall had happened, and he knew that somewhere beneath layers and layers of cool decorum, behind mask upon mask of gentility, lay a woman desperate to come out into the light, but not knowing the way, like a child waiting to be born, but clinging to the familiar, confining safety of the womb. Keeping his promise to her was the one redeeming act he could do in his life. One small act which would bring him no personal absolution, but which might set a fellow mortal free. He could teach her to embrace joy. It was something he could never do for himself, though his acquaintances might be skeptical if ever he were to say so. He wore very different masks from Lauren, but it was possible to teach what one could not practice. It must be possible. He led the way down the drive and across the bridge, before turning to his right onto the path that followed the river and then skirted the bank of the lake. The trees were denser on this side than on the side closer to the house. Sometimes the path wove deeper into the wood, so that the water was lost to sight altogether for a minute or two. He stopped at one such point and looked back to make sure Lauren was having no trouble following. "What do you think?" he asked her. End of side 3. To continue, turn the cassette over.